task?
I think it's 1 to 10 actually. 1 to 9. Das should be.
That's
the
4.
Yeah.
No, okay.
So that's good. We just have to make sure that the noise.
Are these people all speaking?
We try.
I speak something.
I actually did not really want to say a lot either today, so it's more about you guys. But let me just sort of explain what we've been doing.
Okay.
So that you get an overview, and then we let the students discuss and maybe also sketch out a few things.
These are architecture students?
These are architecture students. Most of them are, let's say, pure architecture. I think we also have others from urban, and we have landscape somewhere, one landscape, which we thought was particularly interesting with some of the projects that have the grid, and with the grid, the landscape, and the question of the inside and the outside becomes a little bit blurry.
Is this a required course that they're taking? It's a seminar or it's an option?
It's not. I mean, this is very funny. It's a pop-up seminar.
Yeah, I know.
So basically, we decided to actually do a seminar on the issue of the digital twin, on the question of software, on some of the younger history and theory in architecture, and the largest problem that we have, I think, teaching students and also sometimes in our work is the difference of the transition from analog to digital. So where does the rule-based architectural form generation start? Where do things like semantics come in, if everything is based on data? What does a line mean if there's only points and these things? So
What year are these students?
they run from 2 to 5, so it's bachelor students, and it's also master students.
And do they get credit for this project?
They do get credits, and I'm hoping that this is not the only reason why. I never.
No, but I mean, this is
They do get
happens
credits.
weekly.
It happens. It has happened. It's the 3rd time now, and it happens in total 5 times
Okay.
weekly, and we have about 2.5 hours per session. The students are grouped into groups of 4 to 5. They all had to choose a building or a project done by you, and they also had to read sort of different texts. They're going to tell about that.
Okay, so.
And I have a suggestion regarding the grading that I will copy from your Peter great friend Jackie Kiptis, who I had as a professor. And his seminar, he said to all of us, you guys all get a pass.
Yeah.
But those who want to do something more and give me something to read and comment, go into the risk to get a low pass or to have a high pass.
That's correct.
Very good.
Yes.
And I think it's really great.
So
If you agree.
I had another experience with students. I was giving a class with 30 students, and the final review, all of the projects were up on the wall, and I came in with my assistant carrying a big chocolate cake. Okay? And so my assistant and I, we looked at all of the projects, and then we said, okay, there are 7 really bad projects of the 30, and we cut the cake and gave them each a piece of cake, bad projects first. And then we said, there are 7 very good projects, and we said, you get 2 pieces of cake, and we cut it And we said, so that was 14, then there were left 16 who thought they were going to get 3 pieces of cake. And I said, you who are neither good nor bad get nothing. Yes, you get nothing for being
Just
ordinary. So, and I think the people that chose to do something more, I think we give them 3 pieces of cake. Anyway, and so this is
That's the start.
yeah.
So what we're trying to do, that's the aim, we would like to create an Eisenmann. We don't know what it is yet.
Neither do I.
But it's going to include a lot of networking.
I'm glad you have Mario Carpo because
Yes.
he's and also Lynn, because I know the work of these people. And Carpo has a second book, right? You have the second? No.
The second one is not here because I think this is the foundational one for
That's the
for
one,
the
the
students.
algorithm.
That's right.
This is an interesting one, the Greg Lynn. So I know that. Okay, I'm just thinking what I remember. I don't know this reference.
This is the book that you have there. That's from
Oh,
the
that-
conference from
okay.
from 2017 or
I didn't
18.
see it. I just want to say, so you have the bad copy. I saw this copy of the book and it's awful, and I told Bojanic to redo it, and they've redone it, and you have to look at the date. 2017 is the bad copy, and 2018 is the good copy. Because they've redone it all, it made no sense in 2017, but anyway, it's a rarity now, because there are not many around. Okay, so that's this, the diagram, okay, from 18, okay. This thing, okay, I'm just looking. Okay.
So this is what everybody has to read: the archaeology, Lynn, then the Eisenmann discipline autonomy, and also the digital realm and
And this one?
narrative. This one was read by group 1, Carpo, not everybody.
Okay.
The Carpo, everybody read that, is that right?
Yeah,
Answer?
yes,
Yeah.
that's okay. That's okay. So what are we gonna do today? See some things. I would love to see those students that didn't choose to take a pass and did something else.
I haven't asked the question yet. Let's rewind to last week. Ask the question. Have you guys some diagrams here? Somebody has to dare. Because I was envisaging that we can discuss some of the terminology together with some of the projects and the texts, and dig deeper into what that would mean as an architectural form.
Well, the question
Yeah.
I have for you as well, just being here, why the title Cora, which has nothing necessarily to do with the digital? Number 2, the diagram, which has nothing necessarily to do with the digital, at least in its origin. And so we're now talking about 3 things which seem to me difficult to bring together: Cora, diagram, digital. So that's really interesting to me. It's very provocative as a beginning to think about something problematic, let's say.
Okay. Let me answer the first question.
Okay.
The Cora has nothing to do with what's happening here.
Okay, because
It's there because my position is embedded in the department that is called Cora.
oh, okay, sorry.
And my lab is called Sci-Fi Lab.
So the project, the part of the school is called Cora for some reason.
For some reason.
Okay, so we forget that.
We forget that for now.
Okay, now then we get to the digital and the diagram.
Okay, this is for you guys.
So is there some work we can look at that examines the question? In other words, I don't think necessarily that Greg Lynn, when he says digital Eisenmann, we were working, like in blind people in a snowstorm, trying to find a cup of coffee. So I'm anxious to see what happens with this chart and what we're going to talk about or look at. No, it's okay. Nobody should be frightened.
Volunteers.
You only can learn by volunteering.
So, I would like to start just asking a question, because when we started with all this thing like the digital term, it was for me because I was born in the 90s, so it was way back, and it wasn't a thing that I've come to like at my studies at the architectural department of this university. So it was actually it was the first time I've heard about it. And we were confronted with a project of yours last week, which was the virtual competition for a virtual house.
It was a real competition.
Yeah, it was. The real competition for the virtual house. So we read those texts and we read about those catastrophe diagrams and all this stuff, and then there was like a real project, like the project of the virtual house. And the thing is trying to connect the text, like all the thinking that went into all this, and then the real project, which actually was a competition presented in Berlin. So we've checked up. I checked the internet. I found an article about the competition, and it told me that your procedure was actually, or the virtual house was based on a previous house you built, the house 4. And just through changing some things, because I think he described it like vectoring, because you weren't actually designing the house by the functions. You needed more than, I think, I said, well, he wrote, I will quote it, that a vector influences the space of the house. And I would like to ask that you can describe to us a little more in detail how this worked. How was your all the work that led to the actual house you presented?
Well, first of all, I have very little memory of 1997. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
I'm really very sorry that first of all, the person that worked on the project was a German woman, Ingeborg Rocker, who was also responsible in my office for the Holocaust Memorial. She was the person in charge, and she is now working. She taught for 9 years at Harvard and then went into commercial production of digital environments for the French company Dussault. So if anybody could answer what we were doing with that house, Ingeborg Rocker could do it. And you can easily contact her by email at Dussault in Massachusetts in the United States. She's online. The only thing that I can remember that we found interesting was the difference between an axis and a vector. And that what we were working with were non-axial conditions, i.e. vectoral conditions, which have directionality, they have dimension, they have intensity. There are three conditions that axes, not necessarily because an axis is a line, it doesn't necessarily have direction, it doesn't necessarily have a density, let's say, or an intentionality in the sense that a vector does. And so we were experimenting with, can we produce physical space, I mean space that could be like this room, through vectoring rather than through axial relationships of X, Y, Z, which are the traditional coordinates of Euclidean geometry. And I think the only thing that I can tell you is that we were trying to move away from axes and spaces that were like, this space is clearly axial. What would it mean to be vectoral space? And we tried to take one of the houses, and it could have been house 4, but it could have been any of the houses, and see what vectors would do in terms of producing a physical environment that was, in a sense, purely virtual, that is, in the computer. And I mean, it's a unique, we knew as little about vectoring and virtuality as anybody. Greg Lynn was in the office at the time, so he was part of the kind of work that we were doing. There were several people. There's a professor at the AA in London now, a Frenchman, Georges Legrand, I forget his last name, but Legrand something, Frenchman, who was also in the office, who is involved with, at the AA, and there's a Greek fellow who is the head of the computer program at the AA called, and I should try and remember Yes, yes. He was at the office at the time. I mean, Greg Lynn includes me in the archaeology of the digital. And yes, we worked on one of the first programs to try and produce designing spatial conditions as opposed to merely surface conditions. I was teaching at the Ohio State University at the time, and we asked the computer man, I said, hey, we need a program that we will be able to model physical space with. And he came up with the idea of Form Z, which was the most primitive space modeler that you could have. And we were using Form Z because we couldn't afford at the time a computer in the office. We had to rely on university or engineers for computation. And so what we would actually do is we would draw vectoring virtual conditions, have them then fed into the computer, and the computer would come back, and every day we were exchanging by post, by express post, whatever, and DHL or something like that. We were then drawing over what these computer printouts did. So it was basically, as far as we were concerned, nothing to do with algorithms or computation because we didn't have the capacity to do that. What we were doing was giving instructions that we wanted what we wanted modeled. And so as primitive as I can tell you, we were operating with Greg Lynn, and when all of these projects that you see were all a product of Form Z, which is why they have this funky, segmented surfaces, because those were the only kinds of surfaces and spaces we could model at the time.
So that means you're describing like the computer program and the computer itself as a tool, which isn't actually doing the design because you're the head, like,
Right.
yeah, the subject, you're just putting something into the computer, it prints something out, and you just draw a new line above it because you don't like it, for
And
instance.
I would argue that where we've come today with Rhino, where the students or the people that I teach and work with don't design anything, Rhino designs everything for them. They just decide where to cut spaces and surfaces, and they produce Rhino projects. And to me, the computer has gone so far as to take away being an architect. Rhino is for me the devil. That has taken away the possibility of designing. And when I see Rhino on my student's desk or something, I try in some way to evade these possibilities.
You mentioned this other software that came after Form Z that actually mostly, I'm thinking about Maya, who was actually taken from the film and movie industry.
Right.
And it was much kind of free.
We still use Maya.
Yeah, and it's
But I mean,
much
Rhino
more
is
kind of accessible than Form Z and Form Z was.
No, but I mean, we now don't use Maya for some reason, which I can't tell you, but it's still more difficult to deal with. But I mean, Maya is look. Let me just say this: we still cut by hand physical models. If I could show you a picture of my office today with people there cutting. We're in a competition in Budapest for a museum, and we're cutting physical models. My students in their school all print models. We don't, because I can't control anything with a printed model. I can only produce an end product, and I'm interested in saying, no, let's do this, let's do that, etc. I'm really a false witness to computation. I mean, Lynn has me in his book. That's very nice. Carpo has me in his book. That's very nice. They're absolute colleagues of mine, but I am innocent in the sense that
It's the others who make you what you are.
that's correct. No, but I mean, seriously, I cannot, I watch students looking at these images rotating around, and I think, what the hell, what are they learning doing this? You know, and these images roll around all the time. I don't know if it's therapy, but, and to be honest, I really love cutting cardboard. I still draw. I mean, the inspiration for this latest project that we're working on, I drew on a napkin. I said, look, to my wife, Cynthia, it's got to be this with this, and it's got to do the following things, drawing on a napkin. And you might say that's very romantic, etc. But I've never ever presented myself as anything but working like that. So
I think this is a very good point, because when it depends on the school of where you go and where you look at, but I see that a lot with many students in many countries, that they have a computer and not much material. And when I tell them that we had like these A1 portfolios, which were like 25 kilos, and you would walk through Berlin in '98 to get a job at Liebeskind or something like this, nobody can imagine this anymore. And the question of designing material through something that is not material is of course difficult. So that's a question for you guys actually. How do you design? I mean, do you guys have a conversation with the model, with your hand, with the tool that you observe, that you start sketching, that you put in the computer? Maybe you do a little bit of scripting that gives you a pattern or a tessellation. So what's the tool? Who's the architect? What's the medium? And what's the strategy? And I think we are at a point, and we see this in advertisements for architecture, where all these things look very much the same. And the question is, where's the architecture, and where's the individuality, and where's the design skill? So how do you guys do that? I mean,
I want to go back to the issue of, let's say we're in this competition. Without a precedent, in other words, what I demand of the people in my office and my students, one thing that you did mention, they have to begin not with the computer model and chopping it away and doing this. They have to begin with a precedent. So they have to put into the computer a precedent that has some of the issues that we're facing, whether that's going to Schinkel, whether it's Johnson, whether it's Ledoux, whether it's Palladio, whether it's Le Corbusier, whatever. There has to be some precedent, because I don't want them reinventing the wheel. And so every project that, in other words, we're doing a transport museum right now in Budapest. And I said, look guys, the whole thing is, there's a railroad station here and a tram station here, which are about transport. Why don't we put the museum between the two? Okay, number one. And then we can do the Jim Sterling trick of Stuttgart. We can say you can walk from the train station through the museum without going in to the tram station, so that you're part of your daily work and walk to work or commute is walking through the museum without going in. So that was the precedent that I don't need a computer to do that. And so we're working with the precedent of Stuttgart, which I think is a great model, and it happens to be so. What we've done is not put the museum where they told us, and that's the best law of a competition. Don't do what they tell you to do. You can't win. And all of the work, all of these things that you see, were all the result of winning competitions, not getting commissions. And what I've decided is it's better to be an outlier and lose than do what the competition tells you. So what we're saying is nobody else is going to have the Jim Sterling model, because we're up against Norman Foster, David Chipperfield, all these guys are, conventional people, Bjork Engels, Liz Diller, we're up against that mafia. And so they're not going to do anything that breaks rules. They're going to do things to win. And so what I'm saying is that the precedent moved us into a position where it's outside the competition. And I'm saying always, I think the important thing is to be able to begin with a precedent, not with Maya or Rhino as the precedent. Yeah.
So you're actually saying that the base of a good architecture is a strong concept, like it could be as simple as you mentioned, like the two transport system and all of this. And what I was wondering about was during this digital turn, you can take the virtual house as an example. It seems for somebody who just sees it or tries to feel it very randomly done. So you don't get the first, like on the first instance, you don't get the simple concept. Like other examples are, I don't know, we talked about the convention hall you did, and after reading through some material, you do understand where it comes from, but not on the first instance. So
yeah, but first instance is too easy.
Okay.
I mean, to me, architecture is about a resistance to easiness. In other words, the capitalism that I talked about in the last seminar, to me, capital uses architecture that's easy. And what we're against is trying to be resistant to late capital. And that resistance is not easy, because everybody wants architecture to be an easy situation today. You see it all around you.
What's built around Berlin.
It's not harming anybody.
No.
It's nice, it's enjoyable,
Well,
it's friendly,
right.
and this is
And it's Norman Foster.
and that's not.
It's Norman Foster, architect.
That you had a question or you have a comment, right?
Both, probably. But I find the conversation about Rhino and design very interesting in terms of how you come to your outcome. So, I mean, at my university,
Where are you from?
RMIT in Melbourne. So when we first started to learn about Rhino, I really didn't like it as well, but it was interesting for me because I wanted to use it just as a tool with my outcome already there. So the first sort of process is finding the design outcome, and then just using Rhino as a tool to maybe realize it or to render it. But maybe that's where I want to get into a question to you about diagramming. So, I mean, we talked a lot about this sort of idea of scientific diagramming and conceptual, very abstract, and how you combine those two ways of diagramming. So my question is more, maybe in your history of your work, when do you realize the outcome of your work? And at what stage? Is that a clear question, or?
No, I don't know.
It's very broad.
Here's the thing. If we go to this particular project that I talked about, this transit museum, the diagram for the transit museum is the diagram that we made. If you take the Sterling Stuttgart project, there is a diagram about how to move. There are two types of pedestrian flow. One from the city down through the outdoor circle, without going into the museum, and the other diagram is the entrance to the museum, paying your ticket, etc. And then there's a third diagram of the store and the auditorium, which are open when the museum is closed. And there are three diagrams for the Sterling Museum. We then took those diagrams, not the museum itself, but the diagrams, and put them on the site that we're working on, because we have the same conditions, whether we're doing it, we happen to think that a transit museum connecting two different forms of transportation with a third, that is the transit museum, makes sense. So we have a diagram akin to the Sterling diagram, and to me, already, once we have that diagram, the project is cooked. I mean, in other words, you can either go straight through, you can wiggle through, you can whatever you want. And then it depends upon, to me, what are you exhibiting? So we're exhibiting big scale train cars and train engines and all kinds of transport. Hungary evidently had the first subway in Europe, so we're the first subway cars. And they're also an archive of maybe 100 elements that are not in display but are part of an art. So we are merely adding to the diagrams, the generic diagrams coming from Sterling, to the specific diagrams. We're never realizing anything until we're finished the diagram. And once we finish the diagram, we've done the project. I mean, I don't know if that.
There's realizing the concept maybe, I mean, not the outcome. The outcome is maybe very broad, but do you think that Rhino or these computer programs will be able to be used by students not in a conceptual way in the future? So sort of the combination of both?
Look, according to Carpo, who is my access to, I mean, he's saying that the new programs are dealing with voxels and not splines.
But he's also referring to.
And I don't know what the difference between a voxel-based diagram and a spline-based diagram would be yet, because I haven't cottoned on to what this is. But I'm assuming that we're going to go way beyond Maya and Rhino in the process of computation. The question would be, where does, as you were saying, individual discourse come in? What is the requirement for the individual? What makes good architecture, good design? And I think those are questions that will be asked by your generation of people.
Hopefully.
I mean, that's what the only reason for being in school. To me, I believe that we need to rethink postmodernism, because postmodernism was a reaction to modernism, a necessary reaction. And now that both modernism and postmodernism are dead, and the digital is still using terms and ideas that are the reaction to modernism and postmodernism. So I believe before we can rethink the digital and what we need to rethink what is architecture, no longer worried about modernism or postmodernism. That is, what can be and why should it be? And these are things that everybody at this table you're not burdened with, like I was. My teachers were refugees from classicism. They didn't know anything about modernism. We weren't taught modernism. And then I began teaching modernism 58 years ago, okay? And then it became suddenly, after I started teaching modernism in 1960 and 68, poof, it was postmodernism. So I had to jump quickly to that. And then postmodernism died in '88 with decon. So in my lifetime, I've been buffeted by these strange things that you all don't have to worry about.
But I think this is happening again, because if we look into like simple Rhino, Maya, 3ds Max, it's still a linear design process. I mean, you might create a surface by lofting or something else, but if you think not linear, but complex and systemically, then the voxel becomes interesting.
Yeah.
And then the language, the tool that you guys might want to look into is scripting, rather than, saying line, loft, along, edge, or something like this. Because with the scripting, you can give each function also a weight. A weight, and then you can say, well, we do have a morphogenetic space where in one part it is relevant for this particular program, functions are dead, or in one place it's more relevant for this particular program. But I find that interesting because it relates theoretically back, in fact, somehow to the Kohlhasian thing about the New York hotel.
Let me add to that. When I started in your level of going, I wanted to be a designer. And I thought the power in the discipline was being a designer. And I worked my way up to being in the office of Walter Gropius, which to me, since he was the only live big name around, this was heaven. And I spent 6 months with Walter Gropius, and I realized this was a disaster, and the worst. And so I went back to school, not knowing what I was going to do, but the model was design. And Jim Sterling came down to look at my work, and he honestly said, look, Peter, you are a really good designer, but you don't know anything about architecture. You gotta go and find out what architecture is. And what I found, at the behest of Jim Sterling, was that there was something other than design. And I think the idea of scripting is, to me, today, and the study of scripting and what it means, I think is a better prognosis for the future than wanting to be a designer. And I think the real problem is that we all think that the individual creativity act is the design act, and I think what you were saying is not so, that scripting and writing algorithms and programs, etc., to give you the flexibility of the design act could be more useful. And I'm just saying that today I don't feel as a designer, I feel as a writer, okay? And I was responsible for the creation of Form Z because I sat down and said, this is what I need the instrument to do. I didn't know how to do it myself, but Chris Yesias, who invented Form Z, was the person that I would go and spend time with, say, Chris, if you don't invent something that's spatial modeling, it's unusable for me. And that's led to, we then went into 3D Studio, we went into Maya and Rhino, etc. Gradually implicating other forms of, the guy at the AA is Theo, the Greek guy is Theo. And he was working with me, and George Lebrun was also working. These guys went into the development of scripts and writing. So I think there are other venues for being creative in the future of architecture other than being a designer.
And probably just to add something, like when you say designer, one thinks about an object.
Right.
Like one object.
Right.
And probably when you start thinking through the scripting, you get into a more kind of almost like a network of things that you can start tackling.
But yes and no. If you don't know how to do it analog in a diagram, if you don't know how to set up a system, you will not be able to do a script. I mean, it's
So
like
you know what
the
you're doing.
The thinking, you have to have the mindset from going from an architect that designs an object to an architect that designs a system in a spatial temporal space, with the changing culture all the time. So scripting per se doesn't help you anything if you don't know the logic of what the thing should do. And if you don't know material, and if you don't make things, you don't know what to do either. So I think it's this combination, like when you mentioned that you still do a lot of models, I mean, this is the core. Physical models, I mean, by hand. Like you touch the material, you see the angles, you see what your hands can do, you have a look at how your eyes feel when you see these things, and you compute. So you compute, and the program computes. And I think this together, with the knowledge that we have here as a foundation for something that could become a postage to architectural theory, is very strong.
I think one thing I would add is I'm still convinced that you have to be able to make a plan.
The line weights are very
And
high.
if you can't make a plan, which is beyond the diagram, I mean, the diagram is a plan of systematic organization, but a plan has architectural implications in it. And we were out to see Charlottenhof today, and you know, if you can't make a plan of Charlottenhof, then you don't understand architecture. And my teachers and the guys who taught, teach with me, can draw those things. And if you don't know how to draw a plan of the Villa Adriana, or Villa Giulia, or Charlottenhof, you cannot go into modeling as you like. You have to start from a basic knowledge of architecture.
That's our professor who's very
I'm sure a lot of people are. I mean, but I knew teachers that could sit down with a roll of tracing paper, go over drawing and say, you really should look at Villa Adriana and draw what it was, what was the diagram that was implied. And all of the teachers I knew how to do that. And I'm not convinced that many of them today know how to do that because they haven't been educated for it.
No, it's not enough looking.
Peter, I have a question. You know, when we talk about the possibilities of the digital age in terms of design, didn't you do the same thing already in the pre-digital age? A non-linear design process, the design process is an interactive process, which somehow challenged the notion of the object. You did it already in the pre-digital.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not saying I didn't.
Yes. So the question would be then, what is the difference? Maybe this is a question to what is the difference? You know, what is the possibilities or what is the emerging possibilities of the digital if the really, let's say, you know, capable architects already, also Schickel maybe, had somehow applied a kind of non-linear design process.
Yeah. Non-linear.
Yes.
One question. Are you referring, for example, to the Rebstock project, where you have like a very Cartesian plan of a grid? And because I was
The Rebstock project, but also to the house series, even if they look linear, I guess the process itself is non-linear. And especially those projects that are disruptive in terms of object and subject, of course. So what is the new quality then that has to be defined?
This is the wonderful question.
Where do we look for this new quality?
It's a wonderful question because I think that what has happened before 1985, as in before computers were used, but already digital architecture was done, it has not been embedded yet into a lot of architecture schools. So I think the frame of mind that House 4 and also the projects that we discussed here have, I think it's not yet there. So I think we're not at the point yet. But what could, I mean, of course I could escape now and say, well, we have virtual reality, we have augmented reality and all these things. But I think what that time did is giving us a strong foundation for an understanding of architecture that is system-based and material-based rather than linear. But it's still in an embryonic age. And I think we can see this in many architecture schools, in many architectural projects. If they want to be successful in all these multi-parametric requirements that architecture has, a lot of them are not. And why? This is probably a different discussion. But I think what it opens up is it gives us more possibilities. If I have more tools, I have more variety. But I still can go back to the pencil and the rapidograph, and it might not be worse, you know.
maybe the principle is enough for disruptive non-linear design, because you don't need a lot.
Look, I've watched two of my former students, one Hernan Diaz Alonso at SciArc.
Yes.
I mean, to me, Hernan, I love him, he's very bright, but the stuff is off the wall. Okay.
That's what I mean, actually.
And then you get Mark Gage, also a former student, off the wall. And I say, you know, this is not where I don't believe should be going. You can't produce a structure of urbanity with what Hernan is doing, for example. And SciArc is just a madhouse. I mean, students like to be there because it is fun, it's a fun house, right? But it has I don't believe much application in a real world where real budgets and real clients exist. I think it's a fun house. It's like Archigram was when it came on the scene in the 1960s and Cedric Rice. It was a fun house. The reason why and if you look at the stuff that Super Studio built in Florence, the difference between what they projected in the computer and what they built tells you something about what the problem is.
Yeah, I think with Hernan's projects or Hernan's students' projects, I observe them more as being object focused rather than integrating the systemic parts that we have in the urban
I can't
environment.
disagree, but I mean, they don't seem much like objects to me. They seem like surfaces of fantasy. I mean, they don't seem to have what?
Science fiction.
Yeah,
Sci-fi elements.
yeah. They don't seem to have. I mean, there is. If we want to raise the question that this next symposium is supposedly raising, there is this movement in the United States, could be all over by now. It's a creeping phenomenon of triple O, object-oriented ontology. Now these are another bunch of crazy people, you know, confounding Hegel and Kant, and you know, rewriting philosophy. And I listen to these people talk, and I don't understand a thing. And they're reasonable people. You know, I can talk to them about Bayern Munich. I can talk to them about, you know, normal things that, you know, monkeys talk about. But when they get into talking about architecture, forget it. So I'm in that world. I'm very conservative.
So is this a lost encounter with philosophy and architecture and this triple O?
Yeah, triple O.
Sounds difficult. But the term ontology in architecture is
Right.
difficult. I think each generation has kind of defined it in a different way.
We thought we would have overcome it already.
We thought we did, and then
Not you
Harvard
thinking
pops up with the triple
it's
O.
like a all of a sudden.
Not yet.
Yeah, just what you were saying, I was thinking like, I think in our architectural education we get these tools and like Rhino and 3ds and all these
Well, you
things,
need
and we
to
just
have
start.
to go into an office.
Right, but we don't really have any education in terms of the history of digital architecture, or, I mean, we just did very quickly in the seminar, but we don't really normally get that in our education, or even really, in my experience, having classes that are just about those tools. Usually that's something you just learn on your own, which is interesting, and that's why I think a lot of the time you kind of can also get lost in the multiplicity of things that can be done within those tools, and just the overwhelming amount of commands and scripts and possibilities. So I was curious about how, also the way you were describing how you were first working with the computer and printing things out, putting it into the computer, shipping it, this kind of process, and how that has evolved for you through time, as well as like the programs have evolved, and also how much you kind of retain your authorship still, and how much like how do you still kind of guide that process through the digital, the physical models, but kind of, I guess, more about, I would be curious to hear more about that.
Well, I don't believe that I am where I was 20 years ago. I have no capacity to intervene in the computer modeling that takes place. And what has happened is, as easy has become more complex in terms of what used to be easy is now complex and no longer what I would consider resistant. Here's the problem. So what the computer has been able to do is take things that were formerly resistant to late capital and turn them into easy for the computer, right? And so anybody can produce the stuff that I was producing as difficult for clients. They can now produce it as easy. So here's the problem. What then do we produce that is resistant? That's what's the critical issue for me, is can we use the computer or computation or algorithms or voxels, whatever you want to call it, can we use those systematics to produce resistant form? And what would that be? In other words, what would the nature, if complexity, which was started by Robert Venturi in '66, complexity and contradiction was the resistant form of being, what would that resistance be today? That is the challenge that you all face. And as a young generation, that's what you ought to be thinking about. What could that be?
Do you think they want resistance?
Yeah.
Because I mean, what we observe is
Are
that
you kidding?
there's a lot of projects that deal with participatory design and that sort of stuff.
Anyway,
So
let me tell you this.
it's-
I can't tell you.
And I hope you want resistance.
No, I mean, I don't think participatory design means not resistant. In fact, I would think that they assume that participatory design is a form of resistance to late capital, okay? The question is, what in fact is the response to late capital? In other words, because, look, we're working in Hungary with the most problematic form of government that we can find within late capitalism, let's say, and yet we're all participating. All the radical designers, Liz Diller, Björk Ingels, whoever they are that have some value, and even the high prince of today, Norman Foster, and they're all participating, right? Are they going to produce anything resistant? No. And am I? No, because I don't know what would be resistant today. What I'm saying is certainly if this group of people were in this competition feeling the way they feel about the government, which I assume they feel, without getting into it, then the challenge would be, hey, do this project in a way that's resistant to the forms of government that you find in Budapest, the people that are authorizing this competition. That would be interesting, I think, as an exercise. They certainly know what that would be, because any young generation is resistant by nature. I would believe at least half of them.
Yeah.
Okay, at least half. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just struggling a bit with the word resistance in terms of architecture, because when we look back, what we aren't supposed to do, I guess, because we're the young, we have to look forward. But every resistant architecture is in the modern epoch was turned down by the deconstructivism or by postmodernism. So every resistant, which was actually at the time resistant.
But that's the thing is, we've already had postmodernism, and it's no longer resistant. Is what
Exactly.
I'm saying.
So there's no resistance at all.
No, there isn't. Okay, so there you go. You have a whole world open to you. I mean, I would have thought it's a fantastic time to be a young architect because you don't have to worry about modernism, you don't have to worry about postmodernism, and the heroes of today are really, if Norman Foster is the hero of today, that's a big problem. You
So
know.
you only have to worry about big data and
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
influence architecture.
So to me, I think there's a world that has to be dealing with the digital, dealing with program, dealing with any number of things. Sustainability, I mean, there are all kinds of environmental issues that come in. And the thing is, what is the complexity and contradiction? Don't forget, it was written in 66, so, or say 68. 68, that's 50 years ago, okay? And before that, Le Corbusier, 50 years before, 1918, is Vers en Architecture, the same thing. So it's time to write another script, and it will happen. I'm absolutely convinced of that. There's no reason why it shouldn't repeat itself. And it's 50 years on, and it would seem to me that the people rejecting certain things in schools are the fodder for this kind of resistant condition. And I think it will happen, and it will be interesting for people who are in this class to be thinking about that and how much they are co-opted by the system and how much freedom they have. And late capital is dead, as far as I'm concerned. We don't have a political movement that suggests how the economic system is going to be able to produce old age, healthcare, sustainability, all the services that are now required for people like me who shouldn't be here because I'm outlived my time. You have to pay for me, and you got to have healthcare that I never had before, and sustainable environment, and you have to have all kinds of things, protection against terrorism. So the thing is, democratic capitalism is finito. And the quicker we realize that and face up to it, the better. And I don't know the system that will replace it right now, but architecture certainly has to be part of thinking because it always has been part of the culture. And I'm not pessimistic, I'm really optimistic for these people because why does late capital have to persist? I don't know. And certainly when you look around, there are other forms of government which I don't think are very appealing, like in Hungary, like in Italy, which are problematic, but attempts to say the present situation not working. And of course you see it in Germany clearly. Alternative for Deutschland is, and this to me is not the answer, but it's certainly the stirrings that you have to find an answer to them. And it's not, there was a philosopher, a Polish philosopher, I believe it was, who said the ultimate end of capitalism is fascism. Is laissez-faire capitalism can only lead ultimately to fascism. So we need to find, and it was a Polish philosopher, I can't remember, and I think he was right, that we see these trends all about us. And I think architecture participates in this problematic, and the idea of a resistant architecture to me is an interesting problematic, because because architecture is co-opted. Every time a client walks in the door, he doesn't want antagonism, he doesn't want resistance, he or she. He wants, you know, branding, aggrandizement, beautiful things for my, you know, so we have to do better business. I did a stadium for an American football team. They don't want columns in the front of the view. They want unobstructed view. They want unobstructed, beautiful seats, place to put your beer, place to go to the toilet, place to escape. They want all. They don't want architecture. Nothing to do with architecture. They just want comfort. And I swear to God that all the new stadia I'm in look like hotel lobbies. You know, but that's what the people want. They don't want to leave their hotel lobby. And so, you know, what in God's name are we doing? And you see it all over. And to me, it's a problem whether it's a hotel lobby. My son, a product of my and my wife's issue, is in a thing called glamping, which is glamour camping. What is glamour camping? It's having butler service in a tent. And you laugh, but that's what it is. It's a coming phenomenon, you know. Where you're out in the country where bears are around and wolves and things, but you have a butler that brings you your drink or your tea and makes your bed at night. No, that's where the world is. Can we be on the edge of nature and disaster and being eaten by an animal and have a butler? And that's the excess of capitalism. And my son is involved in this. And it has absolutely no use for me.
It's kind of radical.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was curious because does it mean that the key to a resistant architecture is breaking with the rules to get all those people out of comfort, like the deconstructivists did? Like all the modern houses and everything, they were famous, they were beliked. So they asked themselves what's going wrong, and I just break the rule just to rouse.
You tell me what that answer is. I don't know what the answer is for what is a resistant architecture today. I don't know. It's certainly not modernism, and it's certainly not postmodernism, and I don't think it has to do with the digital. But I think it would be interesting to figure it out. I can't answer that question. All I know is Tegel is the most easy airport to come in and out of. And Tegel, there must be anti-capital, you know, and they want to make a difficult airport to go in. And I said, why do they want to do that?
They're trying.
Huh?
They're trying hard. It's not built yet. So.
I know. So, I mean, I don't hope I haven't disrupted your seminar.
No, I think that's pretty much along the lines that have been going on for about 3 to 4 weeks. That sort of shaking and breaking out of the comfort zone. And I mean, the students who are in my other seminars, they know they don't need to do perfect things, but they need to do radical things.
Well, what is radical? It's not or not.
I think it's radical. One thing that's radical is if it keeps you awake at night as a teacher. And I think one thing that's radical is also that it's not too friendly. Don't make it too friendly. Because you want to have something you can discuss about, and if it's too friendly, there's nothing really to talk about.
What do you all and your students think of someone like Pierre Vittorio Redi? Because to me, he's the most radical young generation. He's 40, but you can't expect anything before 40 to be radical, let's say, or appear. What do they think of him? What's the reaction to his work?
I've just been looking at him actually for a project. I'm in a studio that's about resistant architecture, and with Charlotte she's from ETH actually. She's a guest professor this semester, and
So you are looking at it?
Yeah, but just on our own, we're using him kind of as a precedent for our project.
Well, hey, so, I mean, you just answered my question. You're using him as a precedent for your project. So you must believe that he is in some way resistant as a precedent. I would say that's a good choice. I find him the most interesting young architect operating today. If you don't know him, you should look him up. He certainly is writing. He's done 2 or 3 books. He's just published a long essay in Log magazine, my wife's magazine, which you may or may not know, but he published an essay of 39 pages long on the grid, and from a resistant point of view, which is, I think, really worth reading. A rethinking of grid as an idea. But he would be an example of someone I would think is important to think about. I'm trying to think of others, but he's the most, and he teaches at the AA in London, and he teaches at Yale as well. He's really a very interesting figure. If you want to have someone who is anti-digital, he draws impeccably. I mean, I have several of his drawings. He draws with a pencil, not even a lithograph, but a pencil. Line drawings, I mean, beautiful hatching line drawings like a crazy person would do. And he also paints with a kind of painting where it's not actual paint. I don't know what it is, but you have to rub it. It's between watercolor and you have to rub it on the surface and rub it off, and you keep rubbing in the paint into the surface of it. I don't know what it's called, but we have several of his paintings. But I think he's a really interesting character that someone ought to bring to. He teaches also at the school in Lausanne, the Swiss school is right. There's an
EPFL.
EPFL. Or is it
Yeah.
It's Lausanne, yeah. He teaches there as well. An interesting character. But I mean, it's a different form of radical, I think.
As a question, could one say that this aesthetic of something like hand-drawn, isn't this a kind of late capitalism aesthetic? Because it's something very friendly, something like, for example, Alejandro Aravena and the other Biennale.
Well, if you were to see his drawings, you wouldn't think they're friendly.
Okay.
By the way, I'm not sure that you would consider, or anybody, let's say, selling drawing, would consider his drawings friendly.
Okay.
And I don't think they're friendly. But you should see them.
Yes.
There's a website that has his drawings on them and his paintings. I mean, I know that we have 2 paintings, 2 landscape paintings, and people look at them and say, well, what are they? Why are they? Because they look like nothing. People are frightened most of all about nothing. And something being about nothing. So if you look at his paintings, he calls them landscapes. I ain't sure, but I think it's an interesting question that you ask. Is it a form of late capital easy? And
I would really like to check them because yes.
You
The many.
would be right. I don't find his work easy. But, okay?
Thank you very much for joining in.
We're gonna have I hope some of these people will be coming to.
All of them,
All of them are coming.
So it is.
Okay, but they don't have to.
Second part. No, they don't.
They want to come.
They have to.
They usually want to come.
That's good. Well, thank you for asking me to come in, and I hope, you do well.
Thank you.